Welcome back to Algebra 1. One of the things that we always have to keep in mind is that we might want to factor out a greatest common factor. I look at all of my numbers, I see what is going to go into them. I see that 5 goes into all of my numbers. And when I write that down, I want to have the 5 in front of a set of parentheses, and I have x squared minus 5 divided by 5 is 1. And 5 divided by 5 is 1 again. I am going to find it useful to factor out a negative 1. In this case, I can actually factor out a negative and an x. When I do that, I put that in front. That is going to be a solution for me. And I'm going to divide each of these by negative x. That's going to end up giving me an x squared minus 12x plus, okay, I also have several more down here. I'm taking a look and seeing sometimes I'm going to factor out just a variable, like this guy, I'm going to factor out a y. I do like to look at my smallest number and hope that that's going to go into all of them. And these are a couple of the other problems that we have here. So this next step is to be able to factor trinomials when the leading coefficient, that means the number in front of the largest variable, isn't 1. There's a lot of methods. I'm going to show you 3 on here. We're going to do some examples of each of those. I'm going to try it out on all of them, see which ones you like. It's not about picking one method, it's about picking a method that works for you. So step 1 on this one, I have this square. I'm going to use the area method. And in the square, I place the first term in the first position up here, top left, and the last term, the constant, goes in the bottom right. Next step. So factors of A times C that add to give me B. I'm going to see that in all of the different methods. Here's my list of factors, and you notice that because my original was negative, AC is negative, B is positive, that means that my smaller term has to be negative. So I put my negative in the smaller term here. I tried 1, I tried 2, I tried 3, and 4's on my list. I know I'm done, but what I'm looking for is the pattern that works to give me 1. Here it is. Those are the 2 numbers I'm going to use. Where they go in the square is on both of these. It does not matter which one goes where. And you notice that I added an x to both of those. Once I have the square set up, what I do is factor out a greatest common factor by row and by column. So if I take a look at the columns first, in this column here, the only thing that I have in common is an x. Here, what I have in common, well, 2 goes into both of these, so I'm going to put a 2 here. Completely separate, I'm going to go by row, and in this particular row, I can factor out a 2 and factor out an x. And in this one, because they're both negatives, I'm going to factor out a negative. And both of these are divisible by 3, so there are my greatest common factors. Once I have those, I write out the factors from the very top row, x plus 2 here, and from the very left column, 2x minus 3. Once I have those, I can set each factor equal to 0, solve. That means I'm going to move these over, and I am taking a shortcut. I'm not showing, but it changes sign. This guy's got a couple of steps. I do have to add 3 to both sides. That's going to make it positive, and then divide by 2. So x could also equal positive 3/2. Okay, those are the steps to the area method. Now we're just going to use the steps without writing down what I I do each time. So we start out with our first and last term in these two spots. Then I am looking at the factors of, I'm going to multiply these two things together. I get negative 12. Factors of that are going to add to give me positive 4. So I have negative 1 and 12. That won't work. Negative 2 and 6. And since that works, I'm going to stop. I put one of them here with an x, and I put the other one here with an x. Again, does not matter which order we put them. Then we're going to factor out common factors. From both of these, I can take out a 2. From both of these variables, I can take out an x. From both of these, I can take out a 3. Completely separate, looking this way. Those both divisible by 2 and divisible by x. Because these are both negative, I'm going to factor out a negative. I don't see anything else here, so I do want to write this as a negative 1. That's going to tell me that my factors, writing across the top column that I wrote, putting in a plus sign, and writing down the left-hand side with the negative sign. So if I am solving these, 2x plus 3 equals 0. Moving the 3, it becomes a negative 3. Dividing by 2. I do prefer you to write horizontal fractions. And on this one, 2x minus 1, well, it's going to change its sign when I come over, right? Notice that was a slight shortcut. Dividing by 2. Fractions are perfectly allowed. And we have our two solutions. Next problem, we have it set up in our squares. The multiplication that we have is 10 factors of 10 that add to give me negative 11. So they both have to be negatives, and negative 1 and negative 10. That would multiply to get me this, add to get me this. So I'm going to write negative 1x and negative 10x. Then I'm going to get the factors, and I can take a 2 out of this and an x out of this. Since this term is a negative, I'm going to pull out a negative 1. Factoring out of these, I'm going to get an x. Factoring out here, I'm going to factor out a 5. Since this term is negative, I'm going to factor out a 5. And we have x minus 5 across the top, and 2x minus 1. And if I am solving that, when I set it equal to 0 and move it over, changes sign, this guy's going to change sign, and it's going to be 1 over 2. So let's take a look at another problem. Now, please don't forget that there are greatest common factors, and if I pull them out, it's going to make my life easier. So I'm going to pull this out, and then what I notice is a is not 5 anymore, a is 1. So I can just go factors of c, because 1 times c is c, that add to give me b, and that's going to be 1 and 2. So I'm going to have x plus 1 and x plus 2. Now I still have this 5 out here, but 5 doesn't equal 0. Change the sign when I take these out. Change the sign when I take it out. Okay, that's the first method. Second method that you'll commonly see has an x right here. And on that x, on the top of it, I put whatever b is, and on the bottom I do a times c. So in this case, I have negative 12 and negative 1. Then I am looking at factors of bottom that add to give me the top. That's the factors of a times c that add to get me b. And since this is a negative, that means the larger number has to be negative. And these two multiply, these two add. So I look at it right here, and I don't write out the list as much. Once I have these two things, I am going to set up FOIL, which has 4 terms, first, outsides, insides, lasts. First one comes from the original problem. Last comes from the original problem. And what I add in the middle come from this negative 4x plus 3x. Now, once I have that, I split it into the first part, first 2 terms, second 2 terms, and I'm going to look for greatest common factors, but 2 terms at a time. These two are both divisible by 2x, and these two, well, they're not divisible by anything, so it's just going to have to be 1. That is going to give me the 2x goes on the outside, and when I divide this by the 2x, I get 3x. Divide this by 2x, and I get negative 2. These two don't change, and what I should notice is the 2 things that are in the parentheses are identical. That's a good thing. I'm going to pull them out. And when I pull those out, what I'm left with, I'm going to put in its own set of parentheses. Okay, guys, that's factored. Now, if I am asked to solve, I move this over, positive 2, divide by what's in front of the x. Shortcut. Move this over, it becomes a negative 1, divided by 2. There are my 2 solutions. This is a pretty common method that you'll see. So if we're going to practice this, we're going to start out by putting, this is going to be 4 times 3. This is going to be whatever b is. I am looking for factors of 12. Well, 1 and 12. Hey, that happens to work. Multiply here, add here. That means I'm going to write first term. Second term is going to come from here with an x. It's positive 1x. Second term comes from the 12 over here, 12x plus 3. Now, I split it into the first 2 terms. They are both divisible by x. So I put the x in front. That's going to give me 4x plus 1. These two are both divisible by 3. So I say plus 3. I did divide by a positive. This becomes 4x plus 1. Since both of these things that are inside are exactly the same, I pull that 1 parentheses out. And when I do that, what is left behind gets its own set of parentheses, this plus this. This, when I solve it, moving it over changes its sign, dividing by what is in front of the x, and change its sign. Those are our solutions. So it looks kind of small, nice, and neat when you're actually not writing out all of the, what is the step that I take. Let's try another one. So in this case, I'm going to have a 6 here and a negative 7 here. Well, factors of 6 could be 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. And these two, well, they would add to get me positive, but I can make them both negative. Then I write out my problem. I have a negative 1x and a negative 6x, and add the last term. First 2 are divisible by x, putting the x out in front, gives me 3x minus 1. These two I can factor out. So because this is a negative here, I'm actually going to factor out a negative 2. So that means negative 2 here. Negative divided by a negative is positive. Positive divided by a negative is negative. The 2 parentheses are the same. 3x minus 1. And the other two things go in their own set of parentheses. If I am solving, this becomes positive 1 divided by what is in front of the x. This one becomes positive 2. Solutions. So it looks fairly compact. Okay, last one that we have, we're going to have these two are going to give us negative 14. This is negative 5. Since this is a negative and this is a negative, my larger number has to be a negative. 14 doesn't feel like it would work. 7 would be positive 2. There we go. Add here, multiply here. Since they work, 2x squared plus 2x minus 7x minus 7. What can I factor out of the first two terms? 2x. So I have 2x in front. That divides and gives me x. Since that's 2x divided by 2x, that becomes a 1. Because this is a negative, I'm going to factor out a negative, 7, from both of these. Negative divided by a negative gives me positive. Negative 7 divided by a negative 7 is not 0, it is 1. That means my first factor and my second factor. So x in this first one is going to be negative 1. And if you're a little unsure, go ahead and write it out. Moving that over becomes positive 7. Dividing by 2. So I get 7 over 2. Keep it as a fraction. Keep the fraction upright, horizontal line. The last method that we're going to do, we have the same type of problem. We're just going to go straight to what are the factors of AC that add to give me B. And so we multiply these two, we get negative 45. And what we notice on these is we're looking for negative 4 and we found it. Once we find that, we're going to write out the factors based on A being 1, which it's not. So we have x plus 5 and x minus 9. But we took A and moved it, so we have to move it back. And the way we move it back is we just divide both of our numbers by whatever A is. Once we have that, our goal can either be to simplify as a factor or to solve. If my goal is solve, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify these guys, and I end up getting x plus a third equals 0 and x minus 3/5 equals 0. And that gives me solutions of negative a third, positive 3/5. If my goal is factoring, I still simplify, but instead of writing them equal to 0, I write them as factors. Now, the only thing is if I multiplied this guy out, I actually wouldn't get my original problem, which had a 15 in front of the x. So what I do is I take the denominator and I move it to the front, just the denominators. This is what it looks like. Now, there's a whole bunch of algebra steps that go on in here. What I'm giving you is the simplified version of the steps. Just move it. If my goal is solve, I'm not going to do this step. If my goal is what are the factors, that's when I need to move the denominators. So let's show that a couple times. We're starting with this one, and we're going to keep it the way that it is right now. So we're looking at factors of negative 20 that add to give us negative 8, and we find them. So we write out the factors, but we moved A, so we've got to move it back. And notice very carefully that A is a negative 4, so we are going to put that into the problems. To simplify and solve, positive 2 divided by negative 4 is negative 1/2 with a solution of 1/2. negative divided by a negative is 5/2, which solves to negative 5/2. If we were looking for factors, we would have moved the denominators like this, but a is a little bit tricky on this guy. And a was actually a -4. And in order to do that, we need one of these to become a negative. So I'm just going to pull it out of this guy here, which is going to change both signs. That's going to be multiplied by -1. Notice I didn't affect this guy at all. So this one is slightly tricky because of that negative. We'll have a better way of dealing with that. Factors of 10 that add to give us -7. This is a times c and this is b. Once we find it, I don't have to keep going. I'm going to write those out as factors. Oh, but I got to put a back. And I simplify. If I want to move the denominator because I want actual factors, I'm going to move the 2 in front. When I FOIL this, I would actually get back to 2x squared. So in this case, I'm doing 3 times 8, factors of 24. In order for that to add to a negative, they both have to be negative. And even though there's other factors past this, once I found it and I'm done, and I'm just going to move to the next step by writing the factors out. Oh, but remember that a, I got to move it back. So I divide both of those by 3. Those two both simplify because 12 divided by 3 does simplify to a whole number. Solutions, change the sign, change the sign. For the factors, the 3 has to move, but there's nothing here to move in front of the x. And if I did FOIL this out, I would get back the original problem. Now the last one I want to do has a negative for a, and instead of keeping track of that negative, I am going to factor it out right away. And then that way I'm dealing with positive numbers. So once I do that, I'm looking at factors of a times c is 5 that add to give us -6 now. And that means they both have to be negatives, and we've got it. So I'm not going to write out the -2 times -3. I'm just going to go straight to writing factors. Divide both of those by a, and neither one of them simplifies. If my goal is find the solutions, I've got them. This -1 in front happens to not be equal to 0. That can't give me a solution. This one here does, and this one here does. When it comes to just finding the solutions, I'm not going to take the extra step of moving the 5s. Okay, those are the 3 methods that we're going to use to solve when a is not equal to 1. Your homework will be on Google Classroom. You really don't have too many other things this week, just a lot of practice on factoring and solving. Have a good day.